Hey guys, it's Dollipop. Today I am going to be walking you through my general digital art process. Over on Patreon, I do monthly tutorials for my patrons, and the video component of those tutorials gets posted on YouTube. So this is the very first in my digital tutorial series. So I had a poll on Patreon for what my patrons wanted to see in this tutorial. I had them vote between a specific technique that I use in this video or a general process, and they voted for general process. So this tutorial is basically going to cover what I do to make my digital drawings. It's not going to be super detailed. There's going to be a few textual cues and some light voiceover work. The full tutorial is comprised of course, this video, as well as a labeled and annotated PSD with all of my layers intact and neatly named, so you can kind of follow along with the video. There's also a PDF format tutorial that has screenshots and a little bit more explanation of what I'm doing. The PSD and the PDF can be found on my Patreon for members that pledge $3 or more per month. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, as well as early access to the tutorial videos on YouTube, I will put my link in the description for my Patreon. Every member helps, and there's a lot of really cool stuff on there. So I didn't include the sketching recording because my sketches are really rough, and I create rough sketches on purpose because I feel like if I put too much detail and effort into the sketch, then the line art tends to look stiff in comparison. So I omitted the sketching phase of this tutorial, but I do always start with at least one sketch layer. You can see that in the PDF that accompanies this tutorial. I usually do one really rough layer that's more of a gesture, and then I reduce the opacity on that, and I do another layer above that with a little bit more detailed sketch. But as you can see here, I have jumped right into the inking process. I use a simple hard round brush for inking. I'm actually going to fast forward through most of the inking process because it takes about a little more than a third of the entire process, and most of the techniques I'm going to be discussing are for coloring anyway, so I'll just fast forward through the inking process. So the next thing that I do once my line art is all done is pick my palette. Sometimes I will have a palette already in mind, or sometimes I will be inspired by a palette. But for this image, actually, I just kind of made it as I go. I could probably do an entire tutorial on picking a palette, so I won't get into that now, but it's always the first thing I do because it kind of helps me decide what I want the mood of the piece to be. So next in this image, I actually started with the background. I have begun to do backgrounds first because they're the thing that I kind of put off. So if I kind of knock it out of the way first, then while I'm still kind of excited about coloring the character, then it just makes it easier to get done because it's not like I'm like, okay, the fun part's over, now I have to do the background. But no, so you can see me, I usually start with a sky, and I usually just do things in order from back to front. I like to use kind of soft brushes for backgrounds, even though I really like line art, because it's quicker. Sometimes I will do a full-on background, work it out with line art. My koi geisha that I drew during Mermaid is an example of that. It took very long, and it is something that I want to practice more, but for this piece I kind of wanted the focus just to be her, so I decided to do things kind of with a soft brush. And once again, I'm not really going into very detailed steps for this background. You can see the detailed steps, however, in the PDF that accompanies this tutorial on Patreon, but the video itself is going to be more about my workflow and digital art process, so that's why I'm not going into detail about like exactly what I'm doing in the background and stuff like that. It's kind of a more general tutorial on the steps that I use to digitally color. So once the background is all done, I start working on the character. So what I always do to start out with is I make a color map. I do this for two reasons. One, so I have kind of a layer mask or a selection that I can refer back to. That way, if I accidentally color outside the lines, I don't have to erase. I can just select this color map and then delete the extra. The other reason I do this is so I can plan out the colors of the character. I do this for every single drawing, even if it's just simple. This way you can really kind of plan and see what the character will look like before you finish coloring, so if you want to change something, it's not after you've already shaded and stuff like that. You'll notice at first that my color map is blue. I always pick a color that's going to sharply contrast anything else in the picture. It just helps me see better. So I go around and I just erase any color that bleeds out of the lines. And the reason why it is dark blue is because then I can see the color that bleeds a little bit more easily. After I make sure that there will be no stray pixels, I start to make my color map. So I make it very, very rough. You don't have to color in the lines or anything like that. I just lock the transparency of the map layer and I just start coloring. I like to plan out as much as possible. So you can see me plan out, of course, like the hair color, the lips color, the nails, but sometimes I'll also put small notes for myself. Like you can see me when I do the hair, I pick a couple random bits of pink and put it in there, as well as when I do her little toga romper thing, I pick some blue and pink. This is kind of a note to myself for later about what sort of colors I want to shade these objects with. So I knew that I wanted the hair to be shaded with like a little bit of a pink tone, so that's why I put those random little pink stripes in there. It's just kind of a hint for myself for later, so I can kind of keep the colors cohesive of the piece. So you can see that after I finished the map, before I colored the skin, I decided to add these big tears. I did this for two reasons. One, because sometimes I'll have something in my head that I definitely want to include in the drawing, but I don't usually reference back to my sketches after I start coloring, so sometimes I forget. So I really didn't want to forget to do these tears, so that's why I did them before I colored the character, just because it was fresh in my mind. The other reason is because I enjoy rendering people so much. Kind of similar to why I do the background first. I want the very last thing I do and the thing I spend the most energy on to be the character. So by knocking out everything else beforehand, including these big globulous tears, I can, kind of save my energy, I guess, save my motivation for the part that I really like. I will probably eventually do a separate tutorial on how to do these big tears. That was actually the other choice that I had my patrons make between. It was between, do I do a tutorial just on the tiers or the coloring process, or the overall digital process, and they chose the overall process, which I do agree with, because since it's the very first tutorial, it should be kind of generalized so that when I reference back to my process later, like, you're not confused and stuff. But yeah, so that's why I'm doing the tiers now before I start to actually color. So now it is finally time to color. I got too excited and forgot to record the very first part of me coloring. All it is I create a new layer underneath the map, but I hide the map layer. This is so I can toggle on the map on and off quickly without having to toggle off a bunch of other layers. So then I fill the layer with the skin color. I always do skin first. I think it's because, well, two reasons. So it's usually below everything else, so I don't have to worry about, not being messy. You can see that I shade way outside the lines because other things will cover it, so it doesn't matter. But I think also because it's the biggest thing, so I just feel like it should be done first. So I fill the new layer with the skin color. I do every separate color, or I guess more every object on a new layer, but I don't shade on a new layer. So for example, I created the skin layer and started to shade with a darker color. I'll be shading on the skin layer as long as I'm still working on the skin. I used to shade on different layers, but I feel like, so I could probably go into like a whole other video just about why I shade the way I do. But so even though I'm very into kind of like the cell shaded look, I feel like by shading on one layer per object, I can kind of bring a little bit of a painterly element into my work. As you can see, I kind of color pick and choose, and it's not like I blend because my shading isn't blended, but just I don't know. I like doing it all in one layer. I used to use multiply layers. I don't think necessarily that artists who use multiply layers work any less hard. But for me, it's like, it's almost kind of like the lazy way out a little bit. Like, and I do tons of like tips and tricks and like, hacks and stuff to make like my laziness, work for me. But for me, it's like you get the color that you really want to get if you don't use a multiply layer. So I guess I kind of do digitally paint because even though my style isn't painterly, I select all my colors, themselves. I don't do multiply layers unless I'm doing something specific, but I guess that's kind of off topic. So anyway, please don't come for me saying that multiply artists are lazy. That is not what I meant. But so as you can see, what I do is I just I work one tone at a time. So I do the first kind of shading layer, quote unquote, on all the skin at once. Then I move on to a slightly darker color. I generally tend to pick more saturated, more red tinted, and slightly darker tones than the base color. So as I work, I get a little more red and a little more dark and a little more rich as well. Yeah, so digital art tip number one, never shade with gray or anything like that. I'll probably do a tutorial later on like my quick tips, but yeah. So once I generally use anywhere from 2 additional tones to 4 additional tones, depending on the depth of the piece. This is a really brightly illuminated piece, so I basically just did the base plus 3 darker tones, which is generally what I do for skin. After I do that, I take a color that's a little bit lighter than the base and I add a little bit of highlight. I guess this kind of makes the 4th tone that I use. I tend to add it in specific places, so I do want to pay attention to lighting and the light source, but I generally always also add it on the eyelids, on the cheeks, on the cupid's bow, and some other little places. Just kind of makes the face have a little bit more contour and a little bit more volume to it. After I add the highlight, I then take the base color that I used and I basically do kind of like, I think it's called like rim lighting or backlighting. I'll basically trace the edge of the shading with that base color and it kind of just makes everything pop and stuff like that. It gives it a little bit more contrast, kind of like gives the illusion that it's illuminated from behind. And this is actually another benefit to working on one layer per color, I guess, is that I don't have to switch back and forth between layers if I want to add more shadows or if I want to, like I said, do that rim lighting. It just makes it a lot easier when it's all on one layer. So after I do the skin, I add a bunch of little things that I add to every piece. Blush, a little bit of glow, just a couple other little effects. You can actually find the full tutorial for all of the little things I add to a piece is available for every single patron from $1 as part of a Patreon welcome package, and it goes into great detail about how I kind of make my faces more lively using like blush and makeup and glow effects and stuff like that. So I also decided to add little glowing freckles, which I struggled for a long time with, making sure that they looked good up close and far away. But yeah, so that's just kind of like a little bit of extra stuff that I do add to every piece, just kind of to make it, I don't know, unique and pop and stuff like that. And my coloring process is generally the same for everything else in the image. I color hair and clothes and lips much the same way as I do skin. I take the base tone, I pick darker, richer tones, and I just shade from there, adding highlights and stuff as I go. I will probably do another tutorial about specifically the way I pick shading colors and the shapes that I use, and stuff like that, that kind of gives my art that cell shade quality. But for now, I just basically, I do the same thing as I did with the skin, is I, pick the base color, pick my shading colors, and then just kind of work it out, continuing to pay attention to light source and stuff like that. So after everything is all colored and shaded and looking great, I always kind of put like a nice little overlay on it at the end. It helps me establish more of a light source. It gives the piece a little bit of glow, a little bit of illumination. This is where the map layer also comes in handy. You can just select the mask that is the map layer, so that the overlay or the glow is only on the character. I just kind of play around with opacities. Some pieces I don't add this, other pieces I add it very, very strongly. For this piece I just kind of wanted a soft glow. But that is something I do almost in every single drawing, unless it's just kind of something really simple. So the last thing I'm adding to this one is a prime example of why I usually do things first, because I knew I wanted to have her have like kind of weird, clear, like almost shadows or remnants of wings in a halo. And I almost forgot to add them until the end, probably should have added them first, but so that's kind of why, another reason why I do everything else first, is because like my brain is kind of trained to like, okay, once the final touches on the character are done, like that's it, we're done, woohoo. But that was not the case here. So luckily I did remember to add the wings in eventually. So a couple of final adjustments on opacity and stuff like that, and the piece is pretty much done. This is, like I said, my general digital coloring process. Start with the map, work layer to layer. It's something that I've developed over years and years of just trial and error. It probably won't work for everyone, but it's what works for me. So I hope you enjoyed my first kind of tutorial-esque type thing. Keep an eye out for more specific tutorials on different techniques and things like that. I'm always looking for ideas for more tutorials, so if you have something that you want to see, definitely drop me a comment either here or on Instagram, or anywhere else you can find me. Once again, thank you so much for watching. And don't forget that if you are a patron on my Patreon, if you're at the $3 or above tier, you gain early access to every single tutorial on YouTube. You will also gain access to the accompanying PSD image and little kind of image format tutorial that explains things a little bit more detailed than the video does. And for $5 or more per month, you can actually have a simple art critique once per month from me on any technique. I can also redline, I can provide color advice, kind of things like that. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, the link for my Patreon is down below. We're having a bunch of fun there already, even though the community is still a little bit small, but every single patron I have is awesome, and it is just so cool having people who want to build a community with me. So if you are interested in helping me build that community, definitely check out my Patreon. I have wallpapers, I have high-res images, I have coloring sheets, I have miniature originals even. I have a bunch of fun stuff. So yeah, thank you so much yet again for watching. If you haven't liked or subscribed, please do so. You can also tick the little bell to be alerted of when I update a new tutorial. Everyone have a great day and have fun drawing!